He answered his phone in the middle of dinner, and by the time he hung up, his face had gone the color of the mashed potatoes still steaming on his plate. "Pack a bag," he said. "We're leaving tonight." He wouldn't tell me why. He wouldn't even look at me properly, just stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor like a scream, and started pulling suitcases down from the hallway closet with hands that weren't quite steady. "I'm Claire." And that phone call was the beginning of the strangest, most heart-shattering 48 hours of my entire marriage. It was a Thursday. I remember because Thursday is meatloaf night in our house, a tradition so unshakable that my husband Ethan once turned down a work dinner with his regional director rather than miss it, a decision I still think about with a strange, warm pride whenever I need reminding that I married a man with his priorities in order. We were 3 bites in. Ethan was telling me a genuinely riveting story about a coworker's ongoing feud over the office thermostat, riveting to him, at least. I was mostly nodding and thinking about whether we had enough milk for the morning, and whether I'd remembered to take the chicken out of the freezer for tomorrow, and a dozen other small domestic calculations that fill the average Thursday of an average marriage, when his phone buzzed against the table. He glanced at the screen, and I watched something shift behind his eyes. Not annoyance, not the ugh, work again look I knew so well from 100 other dinners interrupted by warehouse emergencies about mislabeled shipping crates. Something colder. Something that made the hair on my arms stand up before I'd even consciously registered why. "I have to take this," he said, already standing, phone pressed to his ear before he'd even cleared the kitchen doorway. "Hello?" "Yes. Yes, that's me." I kept eating, half listening the way you do, catching fragments through the wall between the kitchen and the hallway. "Confirmed." "Understood." "How long do we have?" "Tonight?" "That's okay." "Okay." "Yes." I'll tell her." "I'll tell her." Those 3 words landed in my stomach like a stone dropped down a well, the kind where you don't hear the splash for a long, long time. I set my fork down. I found I couldn't quite pick it back up. When Ethan came back into the kitchen, he wasn't the man who'd left it 90 seconds earlier telling a story about a thermostat. His face had drained of color so completely that for one absurd moment I thought he might actually faint into the meatloaf, and some ridiculous corner of my brain filed that image away, husband, unconscious, face first in ground beef, even as the rest of me was flooding with a fear too large to name properly. "Ethan." "Who was that?" "Pack a bag," he said. "We're leaving tonight." "Leaving for where?" "Ethan, you're scaring me." "Who died?" "Is it your mom?" "Is it my mom?" "Ethan, look at me, is somebody hurt?" "Nobody died." He said it fast, like he could see the direction my panic was already sprinting in and wanted to head it off at the first turn, both hands coming up in a small, useless gesture of reassurance. "Nobody's hurt. I promise you. Nobody is hurt. I need you to believe that part before anything else." "Then what?" "Why do you look like you've seen a ghost?" "Why do we have to leave tonight, whatever it is? Why can't it wait until morning like a normal emergency?" "There isn't a normal emergency version of this," he said, and something about the way he said it, not panicked exactly, but wound so tight it was almost vibrating, made me go quiet and actually look at him, really look, the way you look at someone when your body finally overrides your mouth. He opened it again, closed it, tried a 3rd time. For a man who talks, genuinely, at length, unprompted, about thermostats and hex bolts and the correct way to load a dishwasher, Ethan does not have a lot of experience being at a loss for words, and watching him fumble for them now was somehow more frightening than anything he could have actually said out loud. "I can't tell you yet," he finally managed. Not because I don't want to. Because if I try to explain it right now, standing in this kitchen with meatloaf on the stove and 40 minutes on the clock, I am going to botch it completely, and Claire, this might be one of the most important things that's ever happened to us, and I need you to trust me for the next few hours, and just pack a bag. Please. I will explain everything. I promise you that. Just not standing here, right now, with the ketchup still out. That is the least reassuring sentence a person has ever said to me. Just not standing here, right now, with the ketchup still out. That is not a sentence that ends a marriage crisis, Ethan. I know. You know, and you're still not telling me? I know, he said again, miserably, already halfway back to the hallway closet, hauling down the good suitcase, the one we only use for actual trips, not the beat-up gym bag we use for weekend visits to his sisters, like a man on a deadline he hadn't set for himself and didn't fully trust himself to meet. I stood there in the kitchen for a long moment, meatloaf congealing on 2 abandoned plates, the overhead light suddenly too bright, the refrigerator humming too loud. Every ordinary object in that room turned strange and vivid the way things do when your adrenaline spikes and your senses go hunting for threats. I looked at the calendar on the fridge, grocery list, dentist appointment Tuesday, a reminder to water the ferns, and thought, absurdly, none of this matters anymore, whatever's happening now. And then I picked up my phone and called Nora. Nora arrived 19 minutes later in her work clothes, still wearing the lanyard from the dental office where she'd clearly left mid-shift, because that is the kind of friend Nora is. She will drop a root canal consultation for you, no questions asked, though she will ask an enormous number of questions once she arrives, usually within the first 30 seconds of walking through your door. Okay, she said, dropping her bag on my counter and surveying the scene, me pacing a groove into the kitchen tile, Ethan upstairs banging drawers open and shut with an urgency usually reserved for house fires, 2 suitcases already zipped and standing sentry by the front door like they were bracing for evacuation. Start from the beginning. What did the voice on the phone sound like? Male, female? Formal, casual? Did he say a name? Was there background noise? Was it an office? Was it outdoors? Could you hear anything at all? I don't know, Nora. I wasn't standing next to him with a stethoscope pressed to the phone. Did he say any words? Anything specific, anything you can repeat back to me exactly? I told her what I'd caught. Confirmed. How long do we have? Tonight. Nora's face did something complicated, the particular narrowing of the eyes she gets when she's cross-referencing a situation against her considerable internal library of medical dramas and true crime podcasts. How long do we have is not a phrase people use for good news, Claire. Nobody says, how long do we have about a surprise party? Nobody says that about a promotion. That is a countdown phrase. That is triage language. Thank you, Nora, that's extremely comforting, please keep going. I'm just establishing the facts. We need facts before we can build a working theory, that's just basic investigative procedure. She pulled out her phone with the same brisk efficiency she uses to schedule dental appointments, already opening a notes app and typing with both thumbs. The way people type when they are treating a domestic crisis with the seriousness of a term paper. Okay. Working theories. 1. It's a medical thing, but not a death, maybe a surgery, something urgent, someone needs an organ, and how long do we have means how long until the transplant window closes. Those windows are real, Claire, they're measured in hours sometimes. That is oddly specific for a random theory. I watch a lot of medical dramas. It's practically continuing education at this point. 2. Witness protection. Nora. I'm not being dramatic, this is a legitimate category of human experience that happens to real people every year. Maybe Ethan saw something at work. He works with inventory logistics. Claire, do you know what kind of things move through warehouses? Do you actually know, or do you just assume it's hex bolts and drywall screws because that's what he tells you? He counts hex bolts, Nora. He has a laminated inventory sheet on the refrigerator at his workplace. I've seen it. It is aggressively boring. That's what they want you to think. That's the whole point of a good cover. The most boring job in the building is always the one worth a second look. I sat down heavily at the kitchen table, staring at the cooling meatloaf, and felt the specific, dizzying vertigo of a life that had seemed completely stable 90 minutes ago suddenly tilting sideways beneath me, the floor of my own kitchen no longer entirely trustworthy. 3. Nora continued, undeterred, tapping her pen against the notes app like a detective closing in. And I say this because I love you and I need you prepared for every outcome, even the ugly ones. It's about him. Like an old relationship. A kid you didn't know about. Something from before you two met, finally catching up to him after all these years. Those things happen. My cousin's husband found out he had a whole other daughter when she turned 18 and tracked him down through one of those DNA kits. That one landed differently than the others, quieter, and sat there in my chest with an uncomfortable weight I hadn't been braced for. Ethan and I had met when we were 24, but 24 isn't nothing, isn't a blank slate scrubbed clean of any history, and for one shameful, spiraling minute, standing in my own kitchen with a friend from the dental office reciting my husband's potential secret histories like items off a menu, I let myself actually consider it, actually pictured a stranger's face, a stranger's eyes that might look like Ethan's, a phone call that had used the words confirmed and how long do we have in. A context I suddenly, horribly, could imagine all too clearly. 4. Nora said, softening slightly, watching my face. And this one's actually kind, I promise. Maybe it's good news dressed up as bad news. Sometimes people panic delivering good news too, you know. My sister cried for 10 minutes straight when she found out she got into her dream program, and everyone who walked past the bathroom thought someone had died. That doesn't sound like Ethan, though. He doesn't panic cry about good things. He gets quietly smug about good things. This was different. This was, Nora, his hands were shaking. Okay. Then maybe it's good news that scared him, specifically, for reasons that have nothing to do with you being in danger. I didn't have an answer for that one, and neither, apparently, did Nora, because for once she set her phone down without a fifth theory ready to go, and just reached across the table and took my hand instead, which from Nora is a bigger gesture of comfort than any theory could ever be. Then Ethan came thundering down the stairs with a duffel bag over one shoulder and an expression that made every theory in that kitchen instantly, obviously wrong, because whatever was happening to my husband, it wasn't guilt, and it wasn't the flat, careful blankness of a man managing a lie. It was something closer to terror mixed with hope, an expression I didn't have a name for yet but would come to recognize very well by the end of that night. We need to leave in 20 minutes, he said. I booked flights. I'm so sorry, Claire, I know this is insane, I know I'm being, please just trust me. Please. I have never asked you to trust me blind before, not in 9 years, and I am asking you now, and I promise you it is the last time I will ever ask it like this. Nora looked at me. I looked at Nora. And then, because there was nothing else left to do, because 9 years of knowing this man had taught me that whatever else was true about him, he had never once lied to spare himself, only, occasionally, lied by omission to spare me, I stood up and went to finish packing my bag. Nora stayed behind to lock up the house and put the meatloaf in the fridge, muttering the entire time about how she was going to need updates every hour on the hour, and if she didn't hear from me by midnight she was calling the actual police, a threat I did not doubt for 1 second she was fully prepared to follow through on. The drive to the airport was 31 minutes long, and I know that because I counted every single one of them, staring out the passenger window at streetlights blurring past, my carry-on wedged between my feet, my mind assembling and discarding catastrophes at a pace that would have exhausted a lesser imagination. Ethan drove with both hands locked at 10 and 2, jaw tight, radio off. Ethan, who cannot drive more than 4 minutes without turning on a podcast about competitive barbecue or minor league baseball statistics, drove in total silence, and that silence told me more than any of Nora's theories had. I watched his knuckles, pale against the steering wheel, and thought about how strange it is to love someone so completely and still, in moments like this, feel like you're riding beside a stranger wearing your husband's coat. "Please," I finally said, somewhere around the airport exit sign, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "Whatever it is. I would rather know now, in the car, in the dark, just the two of us, than find out in an airport terminal surrounded by strangers and fluorescent lighting and gate agents. Please, Ethan." He glanced at me, back at the road, at me again, and I watched him make some internal decision, some final calculation about timing and delivery that he'd clearly been running since the moment he hung up the phone. "You remember Delphine's? The bakery?" Of all the sentences I'd braced myself for, that was not one of them. It landed sideways, disorienting, nothing like the danger I'd been steeling myself against. Of course I remember Delphine's. My stomach did something strange and hollow, hearing the name out loud after 2 years of carefully not saying it, the way you avoid pressing on a bruise even after it's technically healed, just to be safe. Delphine's had been my bakery. Not literally named after me, Delphine was my grandmother, and I'd named the shop after her because she was the one who taught me to bake, standing on a step stool in her kitchen at age 5, flour up to my elbows, learning that a good crust needed cold butter and colder hands and a patience I didn't naturally possess but learned, slowly, to fake until I meant it. I'd run Delphine's for 4 years. I'd poured every cent we had into it, worked 18-hour days, cried in the walk-in cooler more times than I'd ever admitted to Ethan, celebrated small victories, a good review, a wedding order, a regular who came in every single morning for the same cinnamon roll and eventually became more friend than customer. And then, 2 years ago, a corporate coffee chain opened 2 doors down, rent doubled at renewal, foot traffic evaporated overnight the way it does when a neighborhood shifts beneath you without warning, and Delphine's closed on a rainy Tuesday in March with $41 left in the till and a version of me that hadn't fully recovered since, a version of me who still sometimes woke up at 4 a.m., the old start time for proofing dough, with nowhere to go and nothing to prove it for. I don't bake anymore. Not really. Not since. What about it? I said carefully, bracing for something I couldn't yet shape into a fear. Do you remember, before it closed, you submitted an application to that show? The Copper Whisk. I did remember, though barely, the memory hazy and half-buried the way things get when you've made a conscious decision not to revisit them. It had been a Hail Mary, something I'd done at 2 in the morning 8 months before the shop closed, half drunk on cheap wine and financial desperation and the particular sleeplessness of a small business owner doing math that refused to add up no matter how many times she ran it. A customer had mentioned the show in passing weeks earlier, a national baking competition, filmed in Chicago, contestants pulled from small independent bakeries across the country, and I'd thought, in the specific delirium of small business panic, why not? What's the worst that happens? They say no, and I've already heard no from the landlord and the bank and my own accountant this month. One more won't kill me. I'd filled out the application at my kitchen table with flour still under my fingernails, submitted it, and never heard back. I'd assumed, reasonably, that thousands of people apply to shows like that every season and get instant, automated rejections lost in a form letter inbox, and I'd forgotten about it within a week, because Delphine's had bigger, louder, more immediate problems than reality television. That was 2 years ago, I said slowly, watching the airport signage begin to appear along the roadside, green and glowing. The shop's been closed for 2 years, Ethan. What does the copper whisk have to do with anything, tonight, right now? I never told you this, he said, and here it came, the thing his voice had been circling for the last half hour, careful and unhurried even as his hands stayed tight on the wheel. But after the shop closed, I was cleaning out the old laptop, the one we were going to donate, remember, and I wanted to wipe the hard drive first, and I found the application in your email drafts. Not the submitted one. A follow-up you'd started writing and never sent, thanking them for considering you even though you never heard back, saying you understood, wishing them well for the season. You never sent it. But I read it, Claire, and it was one of the saddest things I've ever read, because you wrote it like you were already grieving something you never even got the chance to lose properly. Like you were apologizing to a stranger for having hoped in the first place. My eyes had started stinging somewhere in the middle of that sentence, and I had to look out the window again, jaw tight, watching airport signage flash past in blurred green streaks. So I called them, Ethan said. The production company. About 4 months after the shop closed. I told them who you were, told them about Delphine's, told them the application must have gotten buried or lost in the volume they get every season, and asked, very awkwardly, I want you to know I have never been more embarrassed on a phone call in my entire life. I actually wrote notes on an index card before I dialed like I was asking someone out, whether there was any chance of a late consideration. They said no. Politely, but firmly. Applications closed, season locked, casting decisions final months in advance, that's just how it works, they get this request constantly and can't make exceptions. So what was the call tonight? Ethan pulled into the airport parking structure, found a spot on the 3rd level under a flickering fluorescent light, put the car in park, and finally turned to look at me directly, the way he does when he needs me to hear something completely, not filtered through the distraction of motion or the half-attention of a moving vehicle. That was them, he said. Production. One of their confirmed contestants for this season dropped out 2 hours ago. Family emergency, they didn't say what, just that it was sudden and unavoidable. They keep a small wait list for exactly this situation, contingency names in case exactly this happens, and apparently, because I never stopped calling every few months to check in, which, again, I never told you I was doing, because I didn't want to get your hopes up over something that seemed like a longer and longer shot every single time I called and got the same polite no. Your name was still on that list. First name. First call they made when the slot opened. I stared at him. Somewhere behind us, an airport shuttle bus hissed its brakes, and the ordinary sound felt strangely loud against the sudden ringing quiet in my own ears. They need you in the studio by tomorrow evening, he continued, the words coming faster now, like a dam finally giving way after holding for hours. It's in Chicago. Filming starts the day after tomorrow, first thing in the morning. That's why, how long do we have? I was asking how long we had before you'd need to be there, because I was doing the math on flights in my head while he was still talking, and I panicked, because there's barely enough time as it is, and I didn't want to lose 30 seconds of that time explaining it badly in our kitchen instead of just getting us moving toward an airport where at least something productive was happening. You've been calling a television production company. Quietly. For 2 years. Behind my back. Every few months. Sometimes just to ask if there was any update, sometimes just to remind them the offer still stood if anything ever changed. I know it's insane. I know it probably felt more like a compulsion than a plan half the time, sitting in the car in the work parking lot on my lunch break, running through the same script every time. Claire, I watched you grieve that shop like it was a person. I watched you stop baking anything, even for birthdays, even for Christmas, and I didn't know how to fix it, and this was the one dumb, small thing I could actually do that didn't require asking your permission to hope on your behalf, so I kept doing it quietly, and I genuinely never expected it to work, not really, not after the fifth or sixth no, and now it's worked with basically no notice at all. And I am so sorry that I'm telling you all this in a parking garage instead of somewhere that smells less like exhaust and old cigarettes. I started laughing. It came out strange, half-sob, entirely involuntary, the sound of a person whose nervous system had spent 31 minutes bracing for a funeral and instead received an entirely different kind of hurricane, one made of flour and butter and a dream I'd deliberately packed away in a box marked "Do Not Open." You made my husband turn the color of mashed potatoes, I said, mostly to myself, wiping my eyes with the back of my wrist, over a baking show. In my defense, I did not know how to say the thing I've secretly been chasing for 2 years just happened. We have 18 hours to get to Chicago in a way that wouldn't sound completely insane, delivered in a kitchen, over meatloaf, with a fork still in my hand. It still sounds completely insane, Ethan. It sounds exactly as insane now as it would have then. I'm aware. I had 18 hours and I panicked and I chose speed over clarity. I'll own that. We made the flight, barely, sprinting through security with the specific chaotic energy of two people who'd left dinner unfinished on the table, meatloaf abandoned to the mercy of whatever fate awaits abandoned meatloaf, my carry-on bag banging against my hip with every stride, Ethan half a step ahead of me shouting apologies to strangers we nearly bulldozed on the way to our gate. There was a moment, standing in the security line with my shoes in one hand and my boarding pass in my teeth because I'd run out of free hands, that I caught Ethan's eye across the conveyor belt and we both just started laughing, the unhinged, overtired laughter of two people who had, in the space of 2 hours, gone from a quiet Thursday dinner to a full sprint through an airport terminal chasing a television opportunity neither of us could have predicted that morning. This is the least dignified I have ever seen you, I told him, hopping on one foot to get my shoe back on while a TSA agent watched us with visible, weary amusement. You have flour on your shirt and you haven't even started baking yet, he shot back, so I don't think either of us is winning any dignity awards tonight. I looked down. He was right. A streak of flour, old and forgotten, clung to the hem of my shirt from some earlier, unrelated errand, a small, absurd detail that somehow made the whole surreal night feel more real, not less, proof that ordinary life had been happening right up until the second it wasn't. We collapsed into our seats just as the doors closed, both of us breathing hard, both of us, I think, still processing the last 2 hours in entirely different ways, him with the specific relief of a secret finally, fully unburdened, me with the dizzy, disoriented feeling of a woman who'd boarded a plane one person and was somehow going to land a slightly different one. I have questions, I said, once we'd leveled off and the seatbelt sign had dinged off and a flight attendant had come by to offer us pretzels neither of us had the appetite for. A lot of them. I figured. Why didn't you just tell me you were calling them? Any of the times? In 2 years, there wasn't a single moment where you thought, maybe I should mention this to my wife, over dinner, on a random Tuesday, just as an aside? Ethan considered this with the particular seriousness he brings to questions he's already turned over privately many times, staring at the seat back in front of him like the answer might be printed on the safety card. The first time I called, it felt like such a long shot that telling you seemed cruel. Like handing you a lottery ticket and saying this probably won't work, but let's both stare at it anyway for the next 6 months. You were still so raw about the shop, Claire. You cried every time someone mentioned the word bakery within a 2-mile radius, even accidentally, even in a grocery store aisle. I didn't want to be the reason you had to think about it more than you already were. And the second time? The third? The 40th, apparently? By then I guess it had become this thing I did quietly for myself. Like, I don't know, some people have a jar they put loose change in for a rainy day, something small and private that doesn't require anyone else's approval or attention. This was my version. It didn't cost anything, it didn't take much time, 4 minutes on a lunch break, and it let me feel like I was doing something about the fact that the woman I married stopped doing the one thing that used to make her whole face change when she talked about it. He paused, and his voice dropped, quieter, more exposed than his usual register. You used to talk about croissant lamination like other people talk about their kids, Claire. Layers and folds and resting times, this whole intricate language I never fully understood but loved listening to anyway. I missed that. I missed watching you talk about butter like it was a moral philosophy. I laughed, wetly, and pressed the heel of my hand against my eyes. I can't believe you kept a secret phone call habit with a TV production company for 2 years and the emotional through line is butter as moral philosophy. I stand by it. I will die on that hill. We sat in silence for a while, the plane humming along somewhere over 3 states I couldn't have named in the dark, the cabin lights dimmed low around us, other passengers asleep or absorbed in their own small glowing screens, and I let myself actually feel the size of what was happening, underneath the shock and the airport sprint and the leftover adrenaline still buzzing faintly under my skin. In about 18 hours, I was going to walk into a professional kitchen, in front of cameras, for the first time in 2 years, and attempt to bake, publicly, competitively, with judges and lighting and the specific pressure of knowing that somewhere, someone was watching who could make or break whatever came next, who could hand me back a piece of myself I'd assumed was permanently gone or could confirm, on camera, in front of strangers, that it really was. I haven't baked anything real in 2 years, I admitted quietly, watching the small reading light above my seat flicker slightly with the plane's motion. Not since the shop. I don't even know if my hands remember how. What if I get up there and my hands have just forgotten? What if 2 years is long enough for a whole skill to just quietly leave a person? Your hands remember, Ethan said, with a confidence that felt suspiciously specific, the kind of confidence you only have when you're sitting on evidence. How would you know that? He got a little sheepish, glancing out the window instead of at me, at his own reflection ghosted faintly against the dark glass. Last month. When you made those rolls for your mom's birthday. You said it was just something easy and complained the whole time about your kitchen being too small and the oven running hot on one side, but Claire, I watched you do that thing you used to do, where you go quiet and your whole face changes and you stop hearing anything I say to you because you're listening to the dough instead, the way some people listen to music. You didn't even notice you were doing it. It just came back, like it had never left in the first place, like it had just been waiting under the surface the whole time for permission. I hadn't told him that making those rolls had felt like coming up for air after holding my breath for 2 years straight, that I'd cried a little in the pantry afterward for reasons I couldn't fully explain to myself, let alone to him. I hadn't told anyone that. Apparently, I hadn't needed to. We landed a little after midnight, checked into a hotel 2 blocks from the studio address production had emailed while we were still in the air, and I lay awake until nearly 3, staring at a ceiling that wasn't mine, running through pastry theory in my head like a woman cramming for an exam she hadn't known existed until 8 hours prior, proofing times, oven temperatures, the exact moment a caramel goes from gold to burnt. All of it resurfacing in fragments, some clear as yesterday, some frustratingly, frighteningly fuzzy. Ethan slept fitfully beside me, one hand finding mine in the dark around 2:30 without either of us fully waking, a small, wordless anchor that got me through the worst of the spiral. By the time we arrived at the studio the next morning, a converted warehouse space with the surreal, slightly unreal gloss of every television set I'd ever glimpsed from the outside, all exposed brick and dramatic lighting rigs and a hum of purposeful activity that made my chest tighten on sight, I stood in the green room hallway with a badge that said contestant, late entry clipped to my shirt, feeling something I hadn't felt in 2 years and had genuinely forgotten the exact texture of. Terror. Real, physical, palm-sweating terror, my heart going so fast I could feel it in my throat. Around me, other contestants clustered in small groups, clearly already familiar with each other from weeks of pre-production and orientation calls I'd never been part of, trading easy jokes and shorthand I couldn't follow. A tall man in a chef's coat 2 sizes too crisp was doing stretches against the wall like he was about to run a marathon. A woman with an intricate braid and a nervous energy that mirrored my own kept muttering something about oven calibration under her breath, over and over, like a prayer. I can't do this, I told Ethan, gripping his sleeve in a hallway that smelled like fresh paint and craft services coffee, my voice dropping low enough that only he could hear it. Ethan, I haven't competed against anyone in years. These people have probably been training for this for months, some of them for their entire careers. I have a badge that says late entry, which is basically a neon sign that says this one wasn't even supposed to be here, she's a mistake, she's a scheduling accident. You built a bakery from nothing, Ethan said, gripping my shoulders, steady in a way I badly needed him to be. His eyes locked on mine with an intensity that cut through some of the noise in my head. You made pastry cases that made grown men cry in your parking lot, Claire. I watched a UPS driver once ask if he could buy your entire display case of eclairs because his daughter's birthday party fell through at the last minute and he didn't know what else to do, and you gave him half of it for free because you said no kid should have a birthday without a proper dessert. You are not unqualified. You are rusty. Those are different words. Rust comes off. Rust was never the metal. That's a very generous reframe for 4 a.m. thinking. I've had 2 years of practice believing in you quietly, on the phone, in a parking lot, with an index card of talking points I was too embarrassed to show you. Might as well say some of it out loud now, while it can actually do you some good. A production assistant with a headset and a clipboard appeared at the end of the hallway, calling for the Whitfield entry. Claire? You're up for orientation in 5, then we'll get you wired for sound and into your station, and I felt my stomach drop through the floor of that converted warehouse, through however many stories of Chicago sat beneath it, straight down to the center of the earth and possibly out the other side. Go bake something that makes a stranger cry, Ethan said, kissing my forehead, his lips warm against my skin in a room that suddenly felt very cold. I'll be right here. I'm not going anywhere. I've waited 2 years for this, I can wait a few more hours in a folding chair. I won't pretend the first challenge went smoothly. It didn't. My hand shook cracking the first egg, actually shook, an old woman's tremor in a 34-year-old's hands, and I dropped a full stick of butter on the studio floor within the first 4 minutes, a moment immortalized forever, I am told, in the show's blooper reel, complete with a producer's voice audibly saying "oh no" somewhere off camera. The first 10 minutes were a blur of pure panic. I fumbled measuring my flour, second-guessed an oven temperature I'd known cold for a decade, nearly used salt instead of sugar in a moment of complete mental static that still makes my stomach clench to remember. Across the studio, The other contestants moved with a fluid, practiced confidence that made my own hands feel like borrowed ones, clumsy and foreign, attached to the wrong body. But somewhere around the 15-minute mark, kneading dough that didn't care about cameras or clocks or the 2 years I'd spent avoiding it, something in my chest unclenched, slowly, like a fist finally releasing after being closed too long. My hands remembered, exactly as Ethan had promised they would. I stopped hearing the ambient hum of the studio, stopped seeing the judges pacing at the front of the room with their clipboards and their carefully neutral expressions, stopped even really registering the other contestants at their stations, the cameras gliding past on their tracks, the boom mic hovering somewhere above my head like a patient, silent bird. It was just me and butter and flour and the particular, specific silence that used to live in the back kitchen of Delphine's at 5 in the morning, before customers, before chaos, when it was just me and dough and the small, private conviction that I was good at exactly one very specific thing in this world, a conviction I genuinely believed was gone for good. I made a laminated brioche with a burnt honey glaze, the same recipe I used to sell out of by 8 a.m. every Saturday at Delphine's, back when Saturdays meant a line out the door and my grandmother's recipe card taped, flour-stained, above my workstation where I could glance at it without breaking rhythm, though by the 4th or 5th year I'd known it by heart anyway and kept the card there more for company than reference. The head judge, a famously severe woman named Odile Beaumont, whose critiques had made grown chefs weep on national television, whose reputation preceded her into every room she entered, took one bite, went very quiet, set her fork down with a deliberateness that made the entire studio hold its breath, and then said, into the microphone, in front of cameras and lights and my husband standing somewhere just out of frame with his hands pressed together like he was praying, "This is the first thing I've eaten in this competition that tastes like it was made by someone who missed baking. Not someone who's been training for a trophy, drilling technique in a test kitchen for 6 months. Someone who's been away from a kitchen and is finally back in one. There is a hunger in this brioche. I don't say that often, and I never say it about pastry." I burst into tears on national television, live, mascara running in 2 dark tracks down my face, in front of judges and cameras and a studio audience of 40 strangers, and it was, without exaggeration, one of the best moments of my entire adult life. Somewhere off camera I heard Ethan make a sound that was half laugh, half sob, entirely unguarded, and later, watching the footage back, I would see him wiping his own eyes with the back of his wrist, not caring at all who saw. The second challenge nearly broke me in a different way, not from panic this time, but from exhaustion, the specific bone-deep tiredness of a body running on 4 hours of sleep and pure adrenaline, asked to perform delicate, technical work with hands that had already been shaking with nerves 24 hours earlier and were now shaking, more quietly, with fatigue. It was the woman with the braid, her name, I learned, was Delia, and she ran a tiny patisserie out of a converted shipping container in Portland, who saved me, in a small, unglamorous way that I've thought about often since. Midway through the challenge, my caramel seized, turning grainy and stubborn in the pan, a mistake I hadn't made since my 2nd year running Delphine's, and I stood there for one frozen, humiliated second staring down at a ruined base with the clock ticking and cameras closing in for a reaction shot. Add a splash of hot water, off heat, and keep stirring, Delia said, not even looking up from her own station 3 feet away, her voice pitched low enough that the cameras wouldn't easily catch it. It'll come back. Mine did that in week 2 of testing. Everyone's does, eventually. It was a small kindness, the kind competitors on a televised competition technically have no obligation to extend to each other, and it worked. The caramel did come back, smooth and glossy, salvageable, and something about that moment, a stranger reaching across the pressure and the cameras and the prize money on the line to hand me exactly what I needed, Undid something tight in my chest that had been there since the phone rang at dinner 2 nights earlier. I didn't win that second challenge. I placed fourth out of the 6 contestants remaining, safely in the middle of the pack. No fireworks, no tearful judge speeches, just steady, competent work that Odile Beaumont described, with something almost like approval, as recovered and controlled, which after the chaos of the caramel felt like a genuine compliment. That night, back at the hotel, I called my mother for the first time since we'd landed, mostly because I could no longer stand the guilt of not having called her yet, and mostly because I needed, badly, to hear a voice from before all of this, someone who'd known me back when Delphine's was still just a name on a piece of scrap paper and a dream I hadn't told anyone about yet. "You're on television," my mother said, not quite a question, her voice thick with something I recognized, after a moment, as pride trying very hard not to become tears. "Your father would have, Claire, he would have called every single person he ever met. He would have rented a billboard." "I know, Mom. I still have his old recipe box. Your grandmother's card is in there. I could mail it to you if Ethan already has it," I said, and heard my mother go quiet on the other end of the line, absorbing that, understanding without needing it spelled out exactly what that meant, exactly how long my husband had apparently been quietly, invisibly tending to pieces of my life I hadn't known needed tending. "He's a good one," she said finally. "Yeah," I agreed, watching Ethan across the hotel room, asleep sitting up in the armchair with his shoes still on, exhausted from 2 days of standing in a folding chair off camera cheering for me between takes. "He really is. I didn't win the whole season, I want to be honest about that, because this isn't a story about a trophy, even though I did, eventually, place 3rd out of 14 contestants, which felt, given the circumstances of my entry, like something closer to a miracle than a ranking, a number I still find myself repeating to strangers with more pride than I probably should. What I actually won, the thing that mattered, the thing that outlasted the studio lights and the badge that said late entry and even the small, shining trophy handed to the woman who did eventually take first place, was something much quieter. 3 days into filming, during a break between challenges, a woman approached me in the green room, older, kind-faced, wearing a blazer that said producer more than baker. She ran a small commercial kitchen space back in our hometown, the kind that rents out professional equipment by the hour to small food businesses that can't afford their own storefront yet, a resource I hadn't even known existed 2 years ago, back when I was drowning alone in Delphine's overhead costs with no idea there might have been a cheaper, smaller way back in. She'd seen the Brioche episode air early, some producer's preview cut. She'd cried, she told me, actual tears, watching Odile Beaumont's face change while eating something I'd made with shaking hands at 5 in the morning 2 years after I thought that part of my life was permanently, quietly over, filed away with the $41 left in a till that didn't exist anymore. "I have an opening in 3 months, she told me, pressing a card into my hand with a phone number written on the back in blue ink. "A little stall space, weekend hours only, low overhead, shared kitchen equipment so you're not carrying the whole cost yourself. It's not a storefront. It's not what you had before. But it's a start, if you ever wanted one again." I did want one again. It turned out I'd wanted it every single day for 2 years, in a low, buried, unacknowledged way, the way you want something you've told yourself you're not allowed to want anymore, the way you stop letting yourself finish a sentence in your head because finishing it hurts too much. I start there next month. Small stall, weekend hours, my grandmother's recipe card, the actual physical card, flour stains and all, which Ethan had apparently rescued from a box in our garage sometime in the last 2 years and quietly had laminated, a fact I discovered only when I unpacked our things back home and found it sitting on the kitchen counter, protected under clear plastic, waiting for me like it had known before I did that I'd need it again. I want to be honest about something else, too, because this isn't a story where the grand gesture erases the part where I spent an evening genuinely terrified my marriage was collapsing, terrified in a way that doesn't just evaporate the moment the good news arrives, no matter how good that news turns out to be. A week after we got home, once the adrenaline had worn off enough to leave room for other feelings, once the initial glow of the trip had settled into something more ordinary and Thursday nights had gone back to being, simply, Thursday nights, I sat Ethan down at our kitchen table, the same one, meatloaf stain adjacent, forever slightly marked by that one Thursday now, and told him, plainly, that I never wanted to feel that kind of fear again. That watching his face turn the color of mashed potatoes and being told pack a bag with no explanation had been one of the worst 10 minutes of my life, regardless of what beautiful thing waited on the other side of it, regardless of the trophy shelf or the phone call from the producer or any of it. You don't get to do that to me again, I told him, my voice steady even though my hands, folded on the table, weren't quite. Even for something wonderful. Especially for something wonderful, actually, because the wonderful part doesn't erase how it felt in that kitchen, not knowing if I was packing for a funeral or a flight, not knowing which version of my life I was about to walk into. I know, he said, and he did know. I could see it in the way he didn't try to defend the delivery, only the intention behind it, same as before, same steady honesty that had made me marry him in the first place. 9 years ago now, in a courthouse with Nora as our only witness and a bouquet of grocery store carnations. I panicked. I had 18 hours to get you across the country and I made the wrong call about how to use the first 10 minutes of it. I should have told you in the car, calmly, from the start, instead of making you sit through a countdown with no context, watching me pull suitcases down like the building was on fire. Yes. I'm sorry. Genuinely. Not sorry about the calling, not sorry about pushing for it for 2 years, not sorry about any of the outcome, I'll never be sorry about that part, not for 1 second. But sorry about the 10 minutes in the kitchen. You didn't deserve those 10 minutes. You deserved to know what you were packing for. No, I agreed. I didn't. And I don't want to spend the rest of our marriage bracing for the next time you decide something is too fragile to tell me plainly. There won't be a next time like that. I mean it. Next time I have a secret plan that requires suitcases, you're getting a full briefing, possibly with a slideshow, possibly with Nora present as a witness, because clearly she's already appointed herself my accountability officer whether I asked for it or not. For what it's worth, I added, unable to keep the smile fully off my face, Nora called me yesterday. To let me know that if you ever do something like that again, she has, and I quote, already identified 3 separate exit strategies for Claire, and none of them involve staying married to a man who won't finish a sentence. I laughed so hard I had to put my head down on the table, because of course Nora had called him directly, of course she'd made a list, of course she'd delivered it with the exact clinical seriousness she brings to flossing recommendations at the dental office. She's not wrong, I told him, once I'd recovered, wiping my eyes for what felt like the 100th time in 2 weeks, though this time from laughing instead of crying. Finish your sentences next time, Ethan. Deal, he said, reaching across the table for my hand. Every single one. I promise. Start to finish, no matter how uncomfortable, no matter how long it takes to say. I think about that Thursday a lot now, meatloaf cooling on 2 plates, a husband gone the color of mashed potatoes, for words that could have meant anything at all, pack a bag tonight. I've learned since then that fear and hope can wear almost identical faces, right up until the very last second, and that the only way to tell them apart is to stay in the room long enough to find out which one you're actually looking at. Sometimes that room is a kitchen. Sometimes it's a parking garage that smells like exhaust. Sometimes it's a television studio at 5 in the morning, with flour on your hands and your whole life waiting to see whether it still fits. If someone you love ever asks you to pack a bag with no explanation, hold on to them a little tighter than you think you need to, and ask your questions anyway, gently, without letting go. Sometimes it's the worst news of your life. And sometimes, it's just someone who loves you, working up the courage, badly and clumsily and 2 years too late to say it properly, to hand you your whole life back. Thank you for staying till the end.